Hello and welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with Nancy Drew Whispers in the Fog. 6. A break in the action. A minute passed and then another. Nancy waited breathlessly in her hiding place in the cypress grove. Finally, she took a breath and the aching in her lungs subsided. Straining to pick up any sound from her stalker, she heard only voices in the distance. Bess and George and Ned were calling from her bluff top. They sounded so far away, she was a little disoriented from all her weaving in and out of the trees. If I call back to them, will they hear me? She wondered. I'm sure the stalker will. Can Ned and the others get here before the stranger does? She heard Ned and George repeat their call. The footsteps inside the Cypress Cathedral started up again. This time they weren't the nearly silent ones of someone sneaking up on her as she heard before. There were heavy footfalls pounding towards the hiding place. Nancy saw someone streak by her in a dark blur. The person ran so fast she couldn't tell whether it was a man or a woman. The footsteps grew fainter and fainter. Then, after a few minutes, she heard a motor start up. Cautiously, she emerged from her hiding place. There was no one in sight. She raced in the directions the person had run and come, an opening to the east side of the Cypress Cathedral. In the distance, she saw the dust of a vehicle heading down the road. Nancy, where are you? Ned's voice boomed from the inside of the cypress grove. Stop playing games to get here. I'm here, Ned, she called. What happened? George asked as she, Bess, and Ned went under the arches of the trees. Why didn't you answer when we called earlier? Quickly, Nancy told the others what happened. The girls had seen nothing from their vantage point at the base of the bluff down on the beach. I don't see anyone either, Ned said, and I was on the trail the whole time, from the trees to the bikes and back again. Whoever it was could have come through the same way he or she exited, George said, and just hide in here, waiting for someone to come in, Bess concluded. Someone must have followed us in here. Aren't we jumping to conclusions again? George asked. Every time something weird happens, we assume it's a stalker or a threat. We don't really know if someone followed us here, she added. Right, Nancy? It could have just been someone out for a sunset stroll on the bluffs or the cypress groves. Maybe he or she was afraid of running into you in this dark place. What we see as menacing could have been a fear or suspicion. Nancy shook her head slowly, her brow pleated into a frown. Actually, each one of these incidents by itself could be explained or excused as coincidence or accident or something else completely innocent. But when you add them up, it's just too much. Let's go around here. Maybe the shadow dropped a clue to help us out. Armed with Nancy's and George's pen lights, the four searched the Cypress Cathedral, but they found nothing. Let's get out of here, Bess said. Just about dark, and even with our lights, it's going to be hard to see. Good idea, George agreed. We need to get some rest before we climb the cockpits tomorrow. They picked up their bikes and started back. When they reached Seabreak, Nancy noticed a lot of cars parked on the bluff above the harbor. One of them was the rusty red Mustang. Looks like there's something going on with the diner, Nancy said. Let's stop for a soda. Nancy and her friends locked their bikes in the bike rack and went to the diner. A woman was speaking to them in front of the room. She looked about 45 years old and had straight, dark hair, glasses with gold wire frames. My name is Joan Kim, the woman announced as Nancy and the others walked across the room. I own a small fleet of fishing boats up the coast. I'm told you're having some problems with the whale watching business down here. She paced back and forth. I only know that went through the same thread to our business that you are facing now, Joan Kim continued. We aren't to get the whale watching stopped and our waters kept free for fishing. Nancy led Bess, George, and Ned to the booth inside the door. No one spoke to them, but she recognized several of the fishermen and the waitress she had interviewed the night before. She scanned the room, but did not see Holt Scotto. I'm sure most of you have heard of Andy Jason, Miss Kim said after Nancy and her friends were seated. Beth poked arm at the mention of Jason's name. He tried to bring whale watching boats into my area. Ms. Kim continued. The woman smiled at the crowd, but he didn't succeed. How'd you stop it? Someone asked from a stool at the counter. We banded together, that's how, Miss Kim Kim said. We got all the fishermen together and launched a campaign to keep Andy Jason and all whale watching business out of our territory. What kind of campaign are you talking about? A woman asked from a table close to where Kim was standing. Nothing fatal, Miss Kim added with a laugh, and nothing strictly illegal, but there are things you can do to imitate outsiders and discourage them from staying. As Joan Kim answered the question, the waitress came to Nancy's booth and quietly took their orders for sodas. Nancy watched while the waitresses went back behind the counter. Soon she saw the waitress and cook whispering to each other. The waitress's red ponytail bobbed as she nodded. Then the cook looked toward Nancy's booth. Within minutes, the cook and the waitress returned. The cook was not a large man, but his eyes were a piercing steel gray. I'm afraid you'll have to leave, the cook said to Nancy. The waitress looked a little frightened as she stood next to the booth. Excuse me? Nancy said. It was a question, not a statement. I want you out of here, the cook said. Now. He turned to the waitress. Clear this table, he ordered. With an apologetic half smile, the waitress began taking water glasses and napkins away from Nancy, Bess, George, and Ned. Wait a minute, Ned said. What's going on here? We ordered some sodas. The diner's closed, the owner said, especially to you four. Now I get up and leave. But the sign says you're open, Nancy said without moving. Not to you, the cook said. Not to friends of Katie Firestone. This is a private party. Bess, Ned, and George looked at Nancy for direction. She was only aware that Joan Kim had stopped talking. Hey, it's those outsiders I was asking questions last night, one of the fishermen yelled across the diner. Nancy recognized him from their first meeting on the pier. They got no business being here, a woman shouted. Get them out. Several people came over to Nancy's booth as if to back up the cook. Nancy stood saying, We're not here to make trouble. We've stopped for sodas, and that's all. Ned, Bess, and George slid out of the phone booth and followed Nancy to the door. Nancy could feel the waves of anger and fear that filled the room. She knew they had to leave. Whew! Bess said, climbing into Katie's red bike. I'm glad we're out of the fresh air, even if it's foggy. This place is really creepy. They looked back to see the cook's face glowering at them from the window of the diner. And what about Joan Kim? George said, Did you hear her say nothing fatal or strictly illegal? Wow, gives me chills. Who's this Joan Kim? Ned asked, where's she from? I don't know, Nancy maneuvering her bike on the road, but I'm going to find out. There's no traffic on the 2-lane road down the coast to Katie's and the inn where Nancy, Ned, and Bess were staying. The four took turns leading and then falling back. About 2 miles, George took the lead, followed by Ned and then Bess. Nancy was last and lost in thought. It was no coincidence that Joan Kim showed up at the Sea Break Diner, she concluded. I'm sure someone invited her there. Was it Holt Scotto? And where was he anyway? I would have thought he'd be front and center for the meeting. Nancy's thoughts were interrupted by Bess's voice from the road ahead. I'll take the lead now, she said. Nancy watched her ride to the front as George fell back to the second place. Nancy returned to her thoughts, turning the events of her last 2 days over and over in her mind. So, Joan Kim outfoxed Andy Jason, Nancy thought. That wasn't easy, I'll bet. He's pretty smooth. I wonder how she did it. Maybe I should contact Jason to talk to him about it. Bess led them up to a small rise in the road. There were still no cars in either direction. The wind was chilly and the whips of fog were getting thicker. Who invited Joan Kim to Sea Break? Nancy wondered. Was it Holt Scotto? Whoa, Bess called, interrupting Nancy's thoughts. Hey, there's something wrong with my bike. It's wobbling, and a nasty snap of metal cut off Bess's words. Then her cry pierced the fog. Bess's butt ache seemed to fly apart. Horrified, Nancy watched Bess barrel into Ned, somersaulting over his back wheel and landing with a horrible screaming skid on the side of the road. Bess landed in the dirt. She didn't cry or move out. Ned couldn't keep his balance and tumbled sideways, smashing his bike into a small fir tree. And that's the end of that chapter. See you later.